So thanks for that. I'm always interested to see how companies run events. If this was an American company, it would be, please put your hands together for world-renowned influencer and AI expert, Benedict Evans. But since it's an Irish company, it says, here's Benedict, he's an analyst. I am, of course, a world-renowned influencer and expert. I should just state that for the record. So Des asked me to talk about AI and customer service. And I thought a good way to start talking about that would be to go back in time a little bit. Anyone who doesn't recognize this is Jack Lemmon in 1960 in a movie called The Apartment. And he works as a clerk in an insurance company in a building in Midtown Manhattan. He has a typewriter and a Rolodex and a thing called an electromechanical adding machine, which you can see here. And so he gets given a calculation. He does a calculation on the machine. He puts it in a typewriter. He types it up. He puts it in an internal mail envelope. I'm actually old enough that I know what an internal mail envelope is. All the younger people in the room, ask your older colleagues. And then it goes off to somebody else. And so everybody that you see here is basically a cell in a spreadsheet. And the whole building is a giant Excel file. And once a week, someone on the top floor presses F9, and the whole building kind of recalculates from top to bottom and generates new insurance prices. Meanwhile, the love interest is Shirley MacLaine, who's an elevator attendant, which means she's standing in the elevator, and someone says floor 7, and she presses the button that says 7. And so that's her entire job. So this is a romance between a cell and a spreadsheet and a button. 1965 or so, that company bought one of these, an IBM mainframe, or rather they rented an IBM mainframe, and they automated away all of those jobs. So they didn't have people sitting at desks with adding machines. Instead, they used the mainframe to do that. And a couple of things happened when you did that. Firstly, you just automated everything that you were already doing. But then, over time, you changed how the insurance company could run because it was possible to do new things. And there's a kind of a classic framing when we adopt new technologies, which is to begin with, you make the tool fit the way you work, and then over time, you change the work to fit the tool. So, every now and then in big companies, there's somebody who downloads a bunch of data from their internal system, like some horrible, clunky legacy system, like Salesforce, and they get a and then they get a CSV. They put the CSV into Excel and make charts. They put the charts into PowerPoint and make slides, and they email it around the company. And then somebody says, hey, maybe you should do this in Google Slides, and then you wouldn't be emailing a file around. And then somebody else says, yeah, but maybe our management system should just make the charts, and maybe there should be an AI system that should just tell us what's changed. And so to begin with, then first you make the thing fit the new tool, and then the new tool means that you change how you do your job. And over the last half century or so since that mainframe, we've gone through sort of every 15 years or so, we've gone through one of these platform shifts that changes how we do our work, changes what the tools are, changes what tools can be built, changes what kinds of companies and what kinds of products we all use. And so from the mid-60s to the late 70s, that was mainframes. Then from the late 70s through to the mid-90s, it was the PC, and then it was the web, and then smartphones. And now we have another shift, almost certainly, through to generative AI. And as you go through each of those, you can kind of look at them at a kind of reductive level and say, well, it's a mainframe, it's client-server, it's PCs and Oracle, it's machine learning. But when you go through those, you change what kind of work you can do and what it is that those things could be doing. So mainframes were doing record keeping. They were basically digital filing cabinets, and they did data processing, and they could generate your taxes. But when we went to PCs and we went to SQL and databases, you can actually ask questions about your business. You could call it information management or business information management, business intelligence. And now as we go to machine learning, again, there's this question, well, what is it conceptually that we should think about what this is, what it's going to be doing, how it's going to be changing how we can do business? The one thing that everyone in tech does agree is that this is kind of a big deal. This is a quote from Bill Gates from 18 months ago where he said in his career he'd seen 2 revolutionary demos, the graphical user interface and ChatGPT. And it's kind of interesting that he doesn't mention the internet, doesn't mention PCs, doesn't mention smartphones or the iPod or the iPhone or multi-touch or any of those things. It's the GUI and ChatGPT. And what he's thinking about here is that the GUI was a step change in who could use a computer and what you could do with software, because you didn't need to learn keyboard commands and type them in anymore. You could just click on what you wanted. So this was an enormous change in what could be done with software and how many people could use it. We have something similar now, perhaps, with large language models. Again, a fundamental change in what you can do with software and who can use it, because you can just ask the computer to do something for you. Maybe. And of course, the excitement that flows out from that is this story, young Sam Altman here raising, it's a deal that's now closed since I made this slide, $6.6 billion at $150 billion plus, which is the largest venture capital round ever. And he's probably going to have to raise another 50 or 100 in the next year or two to get him through to profitability, presuming that that happens. On the other hand, when you look outside of the tech industry, everyone thinks it's very interesting, but a lot of people aren't entirely sure what it is that we're supposed to be doing with this. And so this is the CIO of Chevron this summer saying, why exactly should I double my Microsoft spend on 200,000 desktops? Why exactly should I give the cast and crew of The Office at Dunder Mifflin in Slough a copy of Copilot and tell them to use that instead of using SAP? What is it exactly that I'm supposed to be doing with this stuff? And so I think we've got this kind of interesting moment now where this is extremely exciting and a huge technology breakthrough, but we're kind of trying to work out, well, yes, but what do we do with that? And I think kind of a good place to understand this is to go back to look at the last wave of machine learning about a decade ago, when image recognition starts working. And I would show slides like this to big companies, and they would say, well done. Like, that's very clever. We're happy for you, but we're a bank. We don't have pictures of children petting dogs. In fact, we don't have any pictures. We're a large insurance company. We don't actually have photographs. So what is it that this is useful for? Why are we interested? Why do we care? And it took us a while to work out that the right level of abstraction to understand machine learning was pattern recognition. And once you start thinking that this is pattern recognition, then you can start thinking about what kind of patterns you might have and what kind of things you might be able to turn into patterns. And so if you're a bank, again, very obviously, fraud detection is a pattern recognition problem. Customer service becomes a pattern recognition problem. And we spent kind of now almost the last 10 years founding giant companies that turned problems into pattern recognition and unbundled them out of SAP or unbundled them out of Excel. And indeed, some of them were turning problems into image recognition and working out that here is this problem that we can now solve with this new technology. One of the ways I always used to talk about this at a kind of very conceptual level was to say that AI gives you infinite interns. So you would like to listen to every call coming into the call center and tell me if the customer sounds nervous or if the customer agent is being rude. And you don't need an expert to do that. You could get a 15-year-old to do that. In fact, you could probably get a dog to do that. One of my colleagues in the Valley used to say that AI will do anything you could train a dog to do. The advantage of this metaphor being that you can never actually be 100% sure what you've trained the dog to do. The dog is generally doing what you told it, but that may not be what you think you told it, which is kind of a very common problem with AI systems. They're doing what you told them, which is not necessarily what you think you told them. And so we have this whole class of thing that you could not automate, but any kind of mammal brain could do. And machine learning let us automate a very broad class of that. We now have the same conversation with generative AI. Again, we have very clever demos, and it's amazing, but we're not quite sure what it's for. So this is a photograph I took in an antique shop in Manhattan a couple of weeks ago, and I'm kind of a plane geek, and I kind of looked at this and said, I can't work out what aircraft this is. And here it is. It's not. I didn't have a photograph of the actual aircraft. It's a photograph of a model, and it's never seen that model before. But it still worked out which aircraft it is precisely. In fact, that it's an early model of the Tu-22 that has a different shaped engine intake. So this is all very clever, and it's very exciting. And we've all kind of seen demos of ChatGPT where you think, holy fucking shit, how did it do that? Like, computers can't do that. But what do you do with this? And I think the base question to talk about here is to think, well, how good exactly is this stuff going to get? Because 2 years ago it didn't really work, or it was only good for kind of crap demos. And it's suddenly become very, very good by giving it huge amounts more data and huge amounts more compute, and of course huge amounts more money. So it's scaled. As you scaled it with more data and more compute, it got much better. So the kind of foundational question in the tech industry right now is, will the scaling keep happening? We don't have any theoretical model to tell us. We don't have a theoretical model for why large language models work so well. We don't have a theoretical model that would tell us what would happen if we made them 10x bigger or 100x bigger. We also, incidentally, don't have a theoretical model for what human intelligence is. So we don't really know if they're heading towards that either. What we do know is that so far it seems to have worked. And so there's kind of two views here at a kind of very reductive level, there's one view that says, look, the scaling is going to slow down, the laws of physics are going to kick in. What we've got now is more or less what we're going to have, maybe a bit better, maybe 10x better, but not 100 or 1,000x better. And so we should sort of be working on the basis of what we see today. There are other people who will say, no, this stuff is going to scale a lot. It's going to get 100, 1,000 times better. And in that case, these things might be able to just do the whole thing. Like they may be able to do the whole thing that you use 50 different pieces of software to do today. Now, the fun part is nobody knows. There's a line in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy about somebody who spends a year dead for tax purposes, and you kind of might just sort of spend a year dead and come back and find out what happens. But today, you've got people who are at the cutting edge who don't really know. So Microsoft's CTO saying, well, it scales so far. And Sergey Brin saying, yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to scale another 1,000x ahead of where we've got to. And so all of this means that we're sort of sitting looking at this at the moment and thinking, well, what do we do with this? And there's a very reductive answer, which is to say, well, it predicts the next token, which is, yes, very well done, clever, very clever. You've said it predicts the next token. There's a more useful sort of intermediate way of thinking about this, which is to say, well, this does some kind of synthesis and summary. And it does stuff that kind of looks like reasoning. It's not really reasoning, but it can often look like reasoning. And it lets us automate a very broad class of thing that we couldn't automate before. Not everything, but it lets us automate kind of a very broad class of stuff in the same way that machine learning let us automate a broad class of things that we couldn't automate before. And as we kind of start rolling that out and coming back to the quote from Chevron, there are some people who look at this and think, well, this is amazing, I have to have this, this changes my life. And there are other people who look at it and think, I'm not quite sure what to do with this. The example I'm giving here I think is useful is VisiCalc, which was the first successful software spreadsheet. And as you can see from the outfit, this was the late 1970s. What you can't see from the outfit is that that setup cost something over $10,000 adjusted for inflation. Like even the fucking floppy drive was $1,000. A printer was even more. And so they at this point, spreadsheets were something that you did on paper. You did a spreadsheet with a piece of grid paper, with a pencil, and maybe a calculator. And Dan Bricklin creates VisiCalc, and he shows it to accountants. And accountants look at it, and they think, this thing does about 2 weeks of work in 20 minutes. I change the interest rate here, and all the other numbers on the spreadsheet change. And you say that today, and you think, yes. But if you were an accountant in 1980, that was a week or a month of your work because you had to do all of those numbers one by hand. So if you saw this and you were an accountant, you would have to have it. But if you saw it and you were a lawyer, you would think, well, that's great, and my accountant should see this, but I don't do spreadsheets. And the situation we have today, I think, is that if you are a software developer, you look at this and you think this is instantly and immediately useful and I have to have it. And people in the software industry and out in big companies are already saying sort of 20, 30, 40% increase in efficiency in software development from using AI code assistants. Something similar in marketing. Huge increase in efficiency, in the speed that you can produce things, the speed that you can produce first drafts and produced ideas and produce sketches and roughs and mock-ups. Both of these, the errors are easy to see, and there aren't wrong answers, which is something I'll come back to in a moment. And of course, the other thing, where this has had a huge amount of early adoption, is in customer service. Now, there is a challenge across all of these, which is this word errors. This is my favorite example of where you have to be careful. Air Canada used an LLM to build a customer support chatbot. Customer asked the chatbot what the returns policy was. The chatbot gave them a returns policy. It was a very good returns policy. Unfortunately, it wasn't Air Canada's returns policy. And Air Canada refused to honor it. And the customer went to court, and Air Canada said to the judge, well, the customer should have looked at another part of our website as well, not just that part of our website, and the judge did not find this a convincing argument. And so they had to pay. And I think the kind of conceptual challenge here is that you look at these systems, and they look like they're answering questions, and they're not. What they're doing is they're saying, what would a good answer to that probably look like? What would people probably say? What would the average person probably respond for something that looks roughly like that? You can try this today if you go and test these systems. The challenge is to test them on something you know a lot about. So this is a study from Deloitte on people who've used these things, the people who've used these things are more likely to think that they always produce factually accurate answers. Now, they don't. Any scientist working on this will tell you they do not, and by definition cannot, always produce factually accurate answers, but they look like they are. So the test here is not to go to ChatGPT and ask it about something you don't know anything about. The test is to go to it and ask it about something you know everything about, and then ask it questions and go, wait a minute, that's not quite what I was expecting it to say. How do we manage these things? How do we build products around them? Well, there's probably 3 answers to this. One of them is make the models better, the models scale, the error rates will go down. But there's also 2 kind of product-y questions. One of them is you look for use cases that don't have wrong answers or where the errors are easy to see, which is the marketing use case. The other is that you build product around that so that you manage this. So the user doesn't see the errors. You abstract the prompt, you abstract the output, you control how you think about how you design a product around this, rather than just dumping the raw output at the user and telling them to trust it. You think about how you make things with this. Now, of course, once that works, it just disappears. This is a chart of elevator attendants in the USA. Elevator attendant was a job, as I mentioned earlier, and then Otis deployed something called the Autotronic elevator, the automatic elevator, and then, of course, the chart went back down again. But the interesting thing here is, how many of you in the last couple of weeks have used an automatic elevator? When you get into the elevator and you press the button, do you say, ooh, it's an automatic one? It's an electronic elevator. That was the other word that we don't say anymore. It's an electronic elevator. It's got buttons. There isn't a man with an accelerator and a brake. When it works, it just disappears. We don't see it anymore. It just becomes software. And we're kind of going through that process now as we think, well, what is it that we do with this? What do we build? And what are we not expecting? What are we not seeing yet? And I think kind of a couple of building blocks to think about in the context of customer service. Firstly, the thing everyone is looking at, which is chatbots. And I think there's a big conversation to be had around where that's the right thing to deploy and where that's the thing that you're deploying, because that's what everybody has to deploy. Coming more obliquely, I think it's very interesting to think about what it means that basically any translation between any language pair will work now. So you can have people in, you don't have to have people in the Philippines speaking English, you can have people in Cairo who speak Dutch. And you can do that translation pair now as well. What does it mean that translation works in any customer pair? What does that do to customer service? There's a much more general question of knowledge management. What does it mean if you help your users find things? What does it mean if you're helping your staff find things, or you're helping that flow of information within the organization and outside it? But there's also kind of a more basic question, which is, what is it that we're not seeing yet? What is it that's going to happen that we don't predict? A kind of famous quote about this from a guy called Yogi Berra. The other famous Yogi Berra quote is half the things I said I didn't say, which is that most Yogi Berra quotes are actually made up. This one is apparently true. And this is, I found this on TechCrunch a couple of days ago, announcing the launch of something called UberCab, which allowed very rich tech bros to get limousines. Obviously, that's not going to work or not have a big impact on the world. So it's kind of difficult to predict what it was going to mean when you put GPS in everybody's phone. I was actually in the mobile industry in the early 2000s, and we spent a lot of time talking about location. And we always used to say, somebody will walk, you'd go to conferences like this, and someone will say, you'll walk past a Starbucks, and your phone will know, and you'll get sent a coupon by SMS. And the operator will charge $1 for each of those coupons for the location lookup. And that never happened, but on the other hand, none of us realized that location was going to change what taxis were. So it's kind of difficult. There's a sort of the easy, obvious things that you can see, but all the kind of the big changes will be the things that aren't easy to see. And there's a kind of, again, a kind of a framework for thinking about that, perhaps, a framework for thinking about what you can't know, is that with every new technology, the first thing is always that there are new features, that there's incremental cost saving. The incumbents always try and make it a feature. So the incumbents hold a very large event with a rock star in San Francisco, and they say, we are incorporating this into our product, so you don't need to talk to anybody else. You see Microsoft and Google spraying generative AI all over their products. Then you go a little bit further, and people use this to create new products and new capabilities and new revenue lines. You do new things that you actually couldn't do before this became available. And then you get startups using it to unbundle. So startups unbundle Salesforce, they unbundle Oracle or SAP or Excel or Gmail. They pull one particular use case out of some big monolithic product and turn it into a new company. And then every now and then someone will come along and do an Uber or an Airbnb and actually redefine what the market is. in other words, as you look at how you deploy this stuff, you can kind of ask, is this a CIO question or a CEO question? Is this bottom line innovation or is this top line innovation? And the answer is yes to all of those, depending on what use cases, what products, what kind of companies you're talking about. Meanwhile, I think it's kind of worth mentioning that all the stuff that we were excited about before ChatGPT launched is still there, and it's still happening. And one of the ways I kind of think about this conceptually is that the tech industry is always very excited about stuff that's going to happen in 2025 or 2030, which today means generative AI, maybe VR and AR. Some people apparently are interested in crypto. Obviously, nobody in this room was ever interested in crypto, but other people thought crypto was a big deal. And so we think a lot about that. Meanwhile, most actual software companies today are building ideas from 2010 or 2015. Ideas like SaaS, cloud, collaboration, workflow, unbundling, interconnection, automation. And then the rest of the economy is being overturned by ideas from 2000, ideas like maybe people will buy clothes on the internet. I actually was an internet analyst in 2000, and that was a really crazy, dumb idea. No one's ever going to buy clothes on the internet. They might buy books, but that's probably not profitable, but no one will buy clothes. And if we think about what's happened since 2000, all of that stuff is still there, and it's all become really big. This chart in particular of e-commerce is like the most boring chart in the tech industry because it just went up 1 percentage point every year until we went through the pandemic, and then of course it's returned exactly back to the trend line that it was on before. Slightly more dramatic here in the UK, we're sort of back onto the trend line, but UK e-commerce, excluding grocery, is now about 40% of all retail. And what does it mean if you're building a brand or running commercial real estate or trying to talk to a consumer if 40% of retail is online now? Even grocery doubled from 5% to 10%. And one answer is that you get completely new kinds of company. So Shein is now almost certainly the world's largest apparel retailer. It's double the size of Zara and H&M, and it's built that with a completely different logistics model, different operating model, different way of getting clothes made and taking them to the customer. Amazon, meanwhile, is now a $50 billion advertising business, so it's actually bigger than the entire global newspaper industry, not that that's a particularly large number anymore, and it's still growing up and to the right. TV industry is also being completely overturned. Netflix now spends more commissioning TV shows than all free-to-air broadcasters in Europe. Disney is spending more commissioning TV shows than all broadcasters in Europe combined. And that always kind of used to be the case, except that European broadcasters could just buy TV shows from the Americans, and now the Americans are coming in and competing with them directly. So you have a kind of a fundamental change in the competitive landscape. And of course, the other place that there's a big fundamental change in the competitive landscape is in cars, where it rather looks like the Chinese car industry is going to try and do in the next 10 years what the Japanese car industry did in the 1980s and completely overturn all sorts of other established industries, particularly, of course, in Germany. Now, I'm not going to actually talk about all of those, because I think the interesting thing here is that as each of these changes happen, the technology industry changes how something works, but then all the questions are for that industry. So all the questions for Netflix are TV industry questions. All the questions for Shein now are really apparel industry questions. And I think the same thing applies to customer service. All the questions around what AI means for customer service aren't really AI questions. They're all customer service or retail or consumer questions. Then what is it that we do with this? How is it that this changes our industry? And I'm going to come back to one more quote about AI. This is Larry Tesler back in 1970. Intelligence is whatever doesn't work yet. Because once it works, people say, well, that's not AI, that's just software. 10 years ago, machine learning was AI, image recognition was AI. Now image recognition is just software. You take pictures of your kids with your phone, and it recognizes them, and of course it does, because that's software. No one says that's artificial intelligence anymore. Back in the 1970s, databases were AI. Now databases are just databases. You don't go to a, I was going to say go to a cash machine, but who goes to a cash machines now? That's also legacy technology. But you don't go and use your bank and say, oh, I'm using AI now. It's just a database. And I think maybe the kind of structural way to think about this is that technology is also whatever just started working, that once it's working, it becomes automation, and then it becomes software, and then it just becomes cars or media or customer service, and it's back to that industry again. And with that, I will say thank you, and I think we've got some discussion.
It's a pleasure to be beside global renowned analyst and influencer, Mr. Benedict Evans. Give it up for Benedict while we're here. Okay, we shall sit down. So, I enjoyed that conversation. It's a good reminder, the fact that all the all the cool stuff that was already happening is still already happening. And if anything, it's happening in the dark. Our world is one that forces us to kind of think about the future, especially right now, because it's clear enough that customer service is going to get rewritten in the era of AI. At some level, we're trying to push the boundaries of what's possible there. First question is from Brian, who's with a company CE Expert. I'm not sure if he's here or if he's online, but hi, Brian, wherever you are. What advice would you offer to CS folks on adapting to this sort of change in knowledge work in their career? So what should people be thinking about? Like, if you're worried, if you're sitting there like thinking, shit, all this stuff is happening, what is a good sort of first thing to do? Get familiar with it, find a new job, take up farming?
So there's a slide I often use talking a kind of a more general AI presentation where I say, I think all AI questions have one of two answers. The answer is either it will be just like every other platform shift. How should we buy this? Should we buy from the big company or the small company? Should we unbundle it? Is it CapEx or OpEx? Can we put it in this year's budget or next year's budget? How did you do cloud? How did you do databases? How did you do PCs? How did you do mobile? Well, it's like that. And all the other class of question are no one knows. Like, is it going to scale? What happens to the error rates? How many models are there going to be? The energy use is going to collapse and so on. So the answer is either, the answer to that question is, well, look, how many of us today had the job that we would have had 20 years ago or 30 years ago? Or 10 years ago.
Probably zero, I guess. Right?
And, for our grandparents, you might have, you get the job with the big company and then you stay there and then you get the defined benefit pension when you're 65 and and that's it and you're done. That's not the world we live in anymore. And so I don't think AI specifically is a different answer to this. It's kind of like saying, well, you're a designer, how should you think about Macs and PCs and color printing? Well, get curious and get pushing and think about what happens next.
When, if I was to scratch at that a little bit, do you, you wrote before, I remember you wrote an essay about cars, self-driving cars, and this concept of second order and third order effects, hey, if all cars are autonomous, and does that mean the end of gas stations? Does that mean the end of certain cultures and microcultures that exist around motor? When you think about AI, is it obvious to you that it's bigger or smaller than any of these trends? Right now, you present it as say there's cloud, there was mobile, there was these sort of things. A lot of us would sort of say this seems bigger in terms of potential broad societal impact. Are you on the fence?
So there's this kind of comes back to the scaling question on one level. So if these models get 10x and then 100x and then 1,000x better, and let's park for the moment, what would that actually mean? There isn't a straightforward linear scale to say, oh, this is 4.5 times better. But presuming these models get massively better, that's one outcome. And then, does that go all the way to AGI? Again, that becomes another conversation. But there's also a view that says, yeah, we're kind of going to flatten out, maybe not next year, maybe the year after, but this isn't going to go all the way to something that's basically indistinguishable from a person. And so that's sort of, I think, the base question within tech is how much better do these things go? And so that's very different to talking about databases or SQL or 5G or smartphones or something where you saw the original iPhone, and obviously it was going to get better, but you weren't looking at this and thinking, well, what happens if it can unroll and fill the whole wall?
Right.
Or what would happen if it could fly down the street after me? There was a relatively constrained set of possibilities for what an iPhone would be or what the web would be. We don't have that same kind of base constrained idea of what exactly are these things going to be. So that's kind of one question.
Yeah.
I think the other way to answer this is, how do you predict something that's fundamentally unknowable? That almost becomes like a theology question, which is why lots of people started dredging up their half-forgotten undergraduate philosophy, Plato's cave and Pascal's wager, and have another puff of the joint and say, well, maybe people aren't self-aware either. We just think we are. Well, yes, very clever. Thank you.
Dystopian completion.
Yeah, there are questions that don't have answers and can't be analyzed, and so aren't particularly useful to talk about. And then there's the tangible question, which is, well, what do these things do now, and what are they likely to be able to do in the next year or two?
Right. That makes sense. So yeah, there's no clear end point here, so you can only really analyze from what we're seeing today.
Yeah, I'd kind of go back to the Bill Gates quote, which I think is kind of useful, which is, with a GUI, suddenly anyone can do customer service. You don't have to learn what to type into the command line. Anyone could, so you have this much broader envelope of things that could be turned into software. But someone still has to make the GUI. Someone has to make the customer service thing. Someone has to make the tax software. Someone has to make the accounting software or the payroll or whatever it is that you're automating. In theory, you could go to ChatGPT 7 and say, hey, can you just buy this house for me? Mm-hmm. And it would go and work out a scroll and work out that you need to hire a solicitor and hire them. Yeah. And it would work out that you need to tell your bank to do this. And it would work out, it could just do the whole thing. That is sort of right on the edge of engineering and science fiction right now. I don't think we quite really know whether these things really will be able to do that. But that's what we mean when we say these things might really scale. Because then you would have way more stuff that could be done in software without people needing to write all of the individual apps. So that would give you massive increases in how much stuff could be automated.
Makes sense. Okay, we'll go back to a question from David from Times. The question is, once AI CS agents become the norm and the likes of Temu can give Zappos level service, Zappo being an online brand that was famous for high quality service, how do you see that affecting the world of e-commerce or commerce in general?
So I always kind of go back to my slide where I kind of asked about imponderables. What is it that customer service is really trying to do? Is the answer that you want to get a return? Is it that you want to ask questions? Is it exception handling? What is the problem that we're trying to solve with customer service? And is it a problem that requires you to talk to a human? Or is it, the old line about Kaizen, do you clean the factory or do you reduce the sources of dust? How much do these systems change the problem? And, what we get with Temu or Amazon is, well, what happens if instead of having to try the thing on, I just order 3 sizes? Mm-hmm. You can change what those customer journeys look like in different ways from different directions.
And I think in the direct example, you would imagine Zappos built a whole brand on we treat our customers really well, and they have the famous stories where somebody would be on call for 2 hours with a Zappos employee discussing their breakup or something like that. And
yes.
But I guess ultimately they managed to turn it into a brand. Are you saying basically it depends on how a business chooses to weaponize CS?
Well, it kind of depends what it is. So in a practical personal example, I'm booking a flight for my family from New York to London. I booked it with miles. The airline, British Airways, managed to lose the booking. So they've taken the miles, they've lost the booking. They know there's 5 different people involved. And I've spent 45 minutes on the phone with somebody this morning, and it's going to get sorted out. So on one level, this is great customer service. There's a dozen people at BA trying to unfuck this. Mm-hmm.
All right.
But wouldn't better customer service be that the booking just hadn't got lost?
It wasn't fuckable in the first place. Yeah. I think that's when you see customer service, I guess, as a source of error, or as a source of customer confusion. The challenge is I think some brands live on the edge where actually talking to their customers is part of the thing. And it remains to be seen what AI will offer in that world, I guess.
So maybe another way to answer this is one of the ways you could think about that e-commerce chart is the last 25 years of e-commerce has been, what can you turn into Amazon? Mm-hmm. What can you turn into a purely commoditized, packetized system where the system does not know what the product is? The whole point of Amazon is they do not know what individual thing is. It's just a SKU. And so everything gets treated in exactly the same way, which makes it incredibly efficient. But it also means that if you try and buy children's shoes on Amazon, you go one level in and it breaks, because now you can't actually have this shoe but in a different color with a different size. That's just a different SKU. Yeah. So you've got to go back to the beginning and work out what to search for it. And so half the e-commerce journey has been, what can you turn into a SKU? Mm-hmm. And the other half has been, how do you build new experiences that would let you buy that online instead of going to a store, that would let you give experience, recommendation, discovery, service, but on a website rather than going to a physical store, which is what Zappos was trying to do. And it's what, I would have said, what the online fashion industry like Yoox and Net-a-Porter have been trying to do, except that they all appear now to be a smoking hole in the ground. But that's the other side of this. Nobody is going to, in the end it will work, but nobody is going to buy a $5,000 handbag on Amazon, just as they don't buy it in Walmart. Yeah. So those are different customer journeys, which is kind of my point that this is retailing. now. This is not e-commerce, it's retailing, and there's different kind of retailing, and different kind of retailing and merchandising models have different kinds of service.
Have you considered the other angle of e-commerce, which is like generative products, like the idea of like, hey, you go and like effectively like ask the AI to like make the thing, like make the T-shirt, make the suit, you know, give it a mock-up of you, so like kind of really try to recreate a very dynamic in-store thing, and what when the customers can invent their own SKUs in a sense.
We can already see this so you can see this in music. You go to Spotify and ask for relaxing, and you'll be able to go and say, I want a punk rock song about cowboys in ancient Rome, and like you'll just get it. Like you can already, you do that now, and you certainly that's just product building. That's not even science or engineering. You can have that with children's books. You can have that, almost certainly we're starting to get that with genre fiction. I would like another 5, make me 30 vampire fanfic cowboy erotica stories. I'm like not making this up. I've seen this. Like there's a huge kerfuffle in the world of genre writing about like what does this mean? Is this theft? Like how do we understand what that is? So there'll be certain things where it's digital, where it's very easy to generate product. You see Facebook talking about this in Instagram. Like if you follow a lot of architecture accounts, do you care if the buildings are real buildings? And the answer is it depends. If you're doing a mood board for an apartment in a certain style and you give it 50 images and it makes 50 more that aren't real apartments, well, if that might be good.
Yep.
There are other scenarios where it might be bad. It kind of depends why you want it or what you want it for. Product is kind of harder, but again, yes, I would be very easy. If you look at Shein's short-run on-demand manufacturing, yeah, I could go to Shein and type in, I would like a T-shirt that looks like this, and they could say, okay.
Makes sense. Okay, Andrew from Journey Mapper has a question. This is going to education, I guess. How would you teach a 5-year-old child differently here and now in the age of AI? What would you prioritize in their learning?
It's funny. I always see like people I know in Silicon Valley talking about, how their 9-year-old has made their first iPhone app and et cetera, and I'm like, yeah, my son wants to talk about football and girls. So there's always the difference between, you probably remember this yourself as a child, there were always the children's books that your parents wanted you to read and the children's books that you wanted to read.
Absolutely.
Mainly involving farting, I think.
Yeah.
And so there's always a kind of a challenge there. I think, I grew up in the 80s and we were all supposed to learn how to code because that was how it was going to work. And like I write code in Excel sometimes, but I don't feel like everybody should learn how to code any more than anyone should learn how to be a car mechanic, but everyone should know what it is.
Yeah.
So that's one potential thing that you should know what it is so that you understand it as part of the world that you live in and potentially as something that you might be working with. And B, everyone should know what it is as something that they might choose to have as a career. And so just as you want your 5-year-old to do theater and poetry and art and science and engineering, you should also want them to learn about computers, A, to understand the world they live in, and B, because that may be what they choose to do, or may not. They may end up going to work in theater, but they should still understand how it works, just as an actor should probably still understand like how cars work.
Do you think there'll be a thing where like being able to spot AI or AI-generated stuff will be an important thing, or do you think it won't matter?
So, if you think about what we've already seen with the war in Gaza, we have all these images where the image is real, but it's not from Gaza. Or the image is real and it is from Gaza, or it's mislabeled and it's described as something that it isn't. And so I don't think there's a problem of shortage of supply of images. There's a problem of critical thinking and understanding and how we think about that. And that's a problem of filter bubbles, a problem of seeking out people that you agree with, a problem of due skepticism of something that fits what you want to believe. And I don't think that you solve that. I don't think that's an AI problem.
Right.
I think that if it's a problem, it's a problem of the unbundling of traditional media, which is, a much broader conversation. We no longer have 5 newspapers and 3 TV channels who decide what we see. Therefore, the world is different.
Okay, an online question from Milan from savolo.com. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. With AI models becoming increasingly capable of understanding and responding to customer queries, what do you think the future of self-service in customer support could look like?
So I think there's again, I kind of go back to the slide I showed. There's different ways to answer this. One of them is you have a chatbot that can answer questions which might be hard to find on the website, and that sort of, you can kind of broaden that out to think about knowledge management in general. Another answer might be, I'm sure lots of people look at this, so Walmart having a thing where you can search for what would be good to take on a picnic, which is not a good SQL query.
Right.
And so you have different kinds of question or different ways that the user might be able to solve this. I think the other side of this, though, is like most companies, like British Airways accepted, have spent like the last 25 years trying to make their website better. And like thinking about like what are the right flows, where do people get stuck, how do we solve this, how do we make this not be a phone call, make it one button that you can press, or make it something that's easy to solve, or make it not break in the first place. I mean, just as a kind of a parallel from another industry, I used to work with a guy called Steven Sinofsky, who ran Office, Microsoft Office, and then ran Windows. And he pointed out one of these things that's like blindingly obvious when they tell you, which is that before the internet, no one who made software knew when the software crashed. And they had no idea why, but they certainly didn't know that it had happened. And then with the internet, Photoshop crashes, Office Excel crashes, AutoCAD crashes, AutoCAD tells Autodesk, hey, we crashed. Right. Excel tells Microsoft, hey, we crashed. And so the reason why software basically doesn't crash anymore, or a large part of it is they know what went wrong. And I think that is an important part of how one thinks about, having said I'm not a customer service expert, but I think half of this is like, how do you replace the guy in the Philippines? But the other half is, how do you continue making people not have to call the guy in the Philippines?
Yeah. Okay, one from the studio here from Cheryl from Lloyd's Banking Group. As a heavily regulated industry, i.e. banking, we aren't allowed to only use one SaaS, software as a service vendor. How can we integrate multiple AI providers in one ecosystem?
So this is maybe two answers to this. One of them is, this is my slide about every question is either a platform shift question or a no one knows question. And this is kind of an enterprise software question. How do you integrate different kinds of enterprise software? When I worked at Andreessen Horowitz, we invested in a company called SnapLogic, which is a business systems integration system. So you can take your SAP and your Oracle and your Concur and your Workday, and they let you build workflows that sit on top of that. And companies like that, and there are probably a dozen of them, it's not my field, will now let you plug in, and they will also let you plug in Intercom and Intercom's competitors, and they will now let you plug in ChatGPT and Gemini and Llama 3. So that will now be a component that you can that you can get, that you will be offered. And so, it's almost my point that the incumbents make it a feature and startups try and unbundle it.
Yeah.
Like every big company will make this a feature, but every startup will also be saying, look, you can integrate us into your workflow. You can plug us into the flow between between SAP and Workday, and we are your way to do this. And then you will have the AI companies coming in from the top saying, no, you should integrate us directly. So you've got like 3 or 4 or 5 different ways that people are trying to sell you this.
Yeah.
And I don't think that will be different. It will be the same as saying, how would they have sold you fraud detection? Well, do you use the big vendor's small detection product, or do you unbundle it and you plug it in from outside, or do you plug it in from the top or the bottom? This is kind of the same thing. I mean, we were kind of chatting about this beforehand, but like, it seems to me like one of the sort of foundational questions here, like after you talk about scaling, is do we end up using the LLM to control all the other stuff? Do we use the LLM sitting on top as the UX for the user and for everybody else to tell all the other systems what to do? Or does the LLM become just another API call? It's just another of all the different systems that you have, and you're using all of your existing orchestration layers to get all of them to talk to each other. And so ChatGPT is just another of your SaaS vendors.
Yeah.
Or is ChatGPT the thing that sits on top, and every other SaaS is just an API call for ChatGPT? Yeah. I think that's sort of the question we're groping towards. And my default is to say, no, this will be just another API.
Yeah.
But the scaling question is another way of saying, if it gets really, really, really good, then it can just sit at the top of the stack and run everything else.
Yeah, makes sense. For Cheryl, I'd say, like, if the question is localized to customer service, what I'd offer is like, a lot of people use Intercom, but they also might use a slightly more old school thing for back office, like heavy ticketing features or whatever. And oftentimes that architecture of a 1-2, like if Intercom can handle it, let Intercom handle it. If in the case, because if you actually specifically want to inject multiple vendors, because of some ruling internally. What I'd say is you can put Intercom in front of your customer support and still maintain your existing posture that you have, and you'll basically you'll be able to claim you're using 2. Intercom will do 51% or thereabouts of your work. The 49% can still go into your existing system, and you'll work it out from there. Okay. Last question is from someone in the studio here. It's Lee Burkill from Money Supermarket. Do you think there will be a shift to consumers interfacing with AI assistants to buy products and services instead of interfacing with archaic things like websites? So this is like, will bots become the new website, as some people have said?
I think there's obviously this is a scaling question. Like, in principle, if these things get like 1 million times better, then yes, I could just say to this thing, hey, can you optimize my bills for me? And it will go and log into my bank account, look at all of the accounts, see the gas bill and the credit card bill and the phone bill, and then tell me, and then switch everything for me and say, right, I'm done. This is like the dream of like the omniscient servant who could do anything for you. I think what's probably more likely is that I go to the price comparison engine and it says, hey, take a photo of all of your bills. And those are then a ChatGPT API call. And so it sends each of the bills off to ChatGPT, and it comes back and says, that's a Vodafone bill, that's a Barclaycard bill, that's a Thames Water bill, that's your credit, that's your travel card. This is how you can optimize each of them. So it all becomes another API. I mean, a friend of mine is building a company that wants to be a competitor to Money Supermarket. And the way that he thinks about it is like, you could have done that 20 years ago by getting people to type their bills in. You could do it 10 years ago by building a parser for every credit card company.
Forwarding the worst, yeah.
And now it's just an API call, which is kind of my point about the previous question. Does this do the whole fucking thing? Or is this just a new component that makes it radically easier to build certain kinds of product or automate certain kinds of functions or unbundle the incumbents with a better way of doing the same thing? But you've still got thousands of companies out there doing it.
Right. That makes sense. I would love to keep going, but I know we are at time. I just want to say once again, Benedict Evans, thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks.
Thank you.